and welcome to this 40th episode of French Connections Plus.
This show is all about exploring the intricacies of life here in France and tearing apart some of the common cliches about the French.
And there are so many stereotypes. Always fascinating, frequently baffling, France is a country that non-French people love to try and boil down into preconceived notions.
So what are these top cliches about the French, and why are some of them so hard to wash off?
Join us for this French Connections Plus, a special show on French stereotypes. We asked you for some of your favorite cliches about the French, and boy, there were a lot. One of the biggest ones that kept coming up was that the French are always on strike. At least that's what both Stuart Russell and Kathy Thomas said.
Well, la grève certainly does pepper everyday life here in France, whether it's public transport ground to a halt, air traffic controllers keeping planes on the ground, or even your local pool can be shut because staff is on strike. But I think this is such a visible cliche because a strike is often accompanied by a protest.
Ah, la manifestation. Now that's another stereotype that's definitely a true one. French people don't hesitate to take to the streets, usually to defend their hard-earned gains.
And this leads to another stereotype about the French, and that is that we complain all the time. Now, it is true that the French love to grumble, râler, but I think this is a cultural difference that can get lost in translation.
It's not that French people are in a bad mood all the time. It's that complaining has kind of a social function. People here don't complain so much about very personal things. It's more about the strikes, bureaucracy, the government.
It's a conversational tic, a way of doing small talk, the way the British will talk about the weather. It's easy to bond over something that's not personal.
Apart from all the small talk, the French can also be very tight-lipped, but that's a whole different stereotype.
If you ask a foreigner to imagine a perfect French cliché, often a peculiar image comes to mind: a mime. The funny thing, though, is if you ask French people, many aren't even aware of the association. So why the mime? Well, back in the day, the silent art form was a big deal, though the French certainly didn't invent it. In Europe, miming dates back to the early Greeks and Romans. Later, in 15th century Italy, it was absorbed into the hugely popular Commedia dell'arte. Thanks to traveling street performers, it finally came to France in the late 16th century, and it flourished, with mime schools popping up around the country. Over the years, the popular genre was sustained by a long line of chalk-faced Frenchmen. In the 1820s, Jean-Gaspard de Bureau, the father of modern miming, developed Pierrot, a lovable and lovesick character. But perhaps the most famous mime in recent history was Marcel Marceau. Performances of his persona, Bip the Clown, achieved international acclaim. Marceau put his mime act to heroic good use while working for the French resistance during the Second World War and helping Jewish children escape occupied France. His first major performance was in front of 3,000 troops after the liberation of Paris, which may explain why he was such a big hit in the United States. Marceau says he was inspired by Charlie Chaplin. Meanwhile, he's credited with inspiring his friend Michael Jackson and a certain moonwalk.
As you just saw, French mimes are often depicted wearing a stripy top. It's known here as a marinière, and it's a real French clothing cliché classic.
The striped top originally comes from the region of Brittany. Back in the day, sailors, les marins, wore them as undergarments, and later it was adopted as a uniform in the Navy, la marine. Now, la marinière went mainstream and became a popular garment for men, women, and children thanks to the designer Coco Chanel.
Now, she made it fashionable all the way back in 1916. But since then, other designers like Yves Saint Laurent or especially Jean-Paul Gaultier have made the marinière a real part of their collections.
These days, it's a staple that you'll find in many French people's wardrobe. And that can't be said for another accessory that a lot of people associate with the French: the beret.
Soft and round like a crepe, warm, waterproof, and practical, the beloved beret has become the symbol of all things French, along with the baguette, of course. This quintessentially Gallic hat has been adopted as a fashion item around the world, from pop stars and royalty to bohemian hipsters and revolutionary fighters, not to mention a certain Emily in Paris. Abroad, people certainly associate the beret with France. But do French people really wear them?
Ça fait pas partie des trucs culturels de la France, ça, le béret? Enfin...
Ça dépend peut-être un peu des générations.
C'est l'incontournable, voilà. Il est éternel.
Traditionally made out of wool, the beret has been around since the Middle Ages. In France, people call it le béret basque, from the Basque country, but it was actually shepherds in the neighboring Béarn region who developed it.
Je suis gascon et porte le béret.
Il est facile à porter, on le met partout dans la poche. Quand je travaille au boulot, j'ai toujours le béret. Il est facile à prendre à la main.
Snug in the front, flipped back, tilted on the side, there are several ways of donning the hat. Be it in summer, fall, winter, or spring, the beret is an accessory for men and women alike, and even part of the French military uniform.
C'est dans le coup, quoi. Il paraît que c'est à la mode actuellement, les bérets.
Though it goes in and out of trendiness, the beret remains a fashion staple and an eternal symbol of French elegance.
When it comes to cliches, some are hard to wash off. Take, for example, the notion that French people never shower. T.S. Aguilar wrote to say, the French eat garlic in bed and prefer stinky cheese to cover their body odor. For the record, he did say it's part of what makes them likable.
When people think of us Frenchies, a common image that comes to mind is the cartoon character Pépé Le Pew. Le Pew, a skunk, which is paradoxical because France is also known for its vibrant perfume culture. Well, maybe that does make sense, actually.
Back in the day, access to running water was limited, but today most French people say that stereotype is outdated.
Perhaps the stinky French person reputation is linked to another cliche, and that is that France is a chain-smoking nation.
Now, this is one of the biggest culture shocks for tourists when they come to France.
Smoking is still associated with the arts and culture rather than a tacky lack of self-control. It's seen as a romantic, almost rebellious gesture, a rejection of a Puritan society obsessed with self-betterment.
Things are changing, though, thanks to public policy. The number of smokers has dropped dramatically in France. But even as things change, some stereotypes are just hard to stamp out.
To poke a little further into the seemingly bottomless pit that are French cliches, I'm joined by Lindsay Tramuta. Thank you so much for being with us today on French Connections.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a Paris-based journalist and author of the book The New Parisienne, which is all about tearing apart stereotypes. It seems like the number of stereotypes about the French is a little exaggerated compared to the size of the country. I mean, if you compare it to neighboring countries, Germany or Spain, there seems to be more cliches about the French. Why this obsession about the French?
I think, first of all, France looms large in a big way in popular imagination, in fascination. Certainly Americans have been coming here for generations and generations, and it is still the most visited country in the world. So, when you think of it that way, it's sort of normal that our attention naturally directs toward any sort of story or idea that comes out of that country.
So you've been living in Paris for over 15 years now. You're familiar with the locals. What percentage of these stereotypes are true?
I mean, I think when you talk about stereotypes in general, there's always a nugget of truth. I mean, that's where they're coming from. And ultimately, when you consider that why stereotypes persist about anybody in general or any nation, it's our way of making sense of the world. It's a way of understanding ourselves and our nation in relationship to others. But unfortunately, given how tribal we are, that can come with, negative qualifiers. And then they get perpetuated by popular culture, media, things like war, any opportunity that can allow these ideas to be amplified and considered truth. And so it's very hard to shake them off.
And how much do you think these stereotypes are just cultural differences that get lost in translation?
For sure, I think there's an element of truth related to cultural differences. But I think it is often blown up in order to, again, to make sense of a people or a place, but then it reduces them. And that's the big danger of stereotypes, and particularly the most pernicious of them, which is that it reduces an entire set of people to a few half-truths or near truths or embellished truths. And that's what's so dangerous about stereotype. And you know, you see that even now perpetuated with big television shows about, you know, that have featured France prominently, Emily in Paris, you know, my favorite topic of conversation. But you see it in literature, you see it in politics. I think you have to look at all of the ways that people consume ideas about places and people other than themselves, and you can find the source of why they endure.
Lindsay, thank you so much for being with us today on French Connection.
Thank you.
Clichés aren't always negative. Many of you pointed out that France and the French are very romantic. Emma Franks wrote, "France is the country of love," while Charles G said, "Good kissers? Maybe it's not such a cliché."
The French do have the reputation of being passionate, first-class lovers. I mean, just look at any Hollywood film, and it's true that we have a lot going for us. For instance, French has been called the language of love.
The French have a long-standing tradition with seduction, seen as part of the pleasure-driven lifestyle. And whether it's sex or PDA, it's just not that taboo here. Even cheating isn't as shunned as it is in some other countries. Having said that, things like French flirting or chivalry, galanterie are coming under increasing scrutiny in the wake of the Me Too movement.
There is one form of love that's not controversial, however, and that is our love of food, even though it's true that at times we eat some questionable dishes. For instance, Sylvie Leslie said that French people eat snails and frog legs all the time.
And don't forget French onion soup. Okay, they do eat those things some of the times, just not every day. What is true is that the French worship food, whether it's wine and cheese, regional specialties, gastronomy is a real way of life.
And I'm proud to say that that cliche is 100% true.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. And don't forget, you can tweet your own questions at Villeminot or reach out on social media.
And we'll see you soon for another episode of French Connections Plus.